Hi, welcome to the National Critics' Choice Online News, the Steinberg Review, and I'm Robin Steinberg. Welcome to my show again. Today we have a very distinguished guest who is from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. He's none other than Dr. Jackson Ewing, and he's a research fellow for Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies, who's here going to talk about food security around the globe, and really there will be some updates that you probably want to know. Dr. Jackson, welcome to my show.
Thank you for having me.
And tell us about what's happening with food security and the perspective and prospects of food security in Asia and also around the globe.
Certainly, food security I think is moving up the international agenda of policymakers, non-governmental organizations, and countries themselves, both here in Asia and internationally. There have been some fairly confronting price movements over the past year, as well as during the past several years, that have driven more people into a position of food insecurity, which has really spurned, I think, greater attention than we've seen since the 1970s towards ensuring the stability of supply and access to food via affordable pricing currently as a real policy priority for countries and international institutions.
Now, what kind of availability does make access both the policymaker and the public today? What sort of challenges do you see in terms of the physical and economic access as well as the utilization?
Okay. With availability, it's useful to divide it into physical availability and economic availability. So physical availability actually refers to the presence of food that can be accessed by a population. If there's an absolute shortage on that front, no amount of economic capability can reconcile that problem. We see this at times in rural areas in some of the more impoverished zones of Asia and Africa and elsewhere. Perhaps a larger problem, a more widespread problem, is relating to economic access, however, and that is, just as it sounds, when the citizenry is unable to afford food at the prices in which it's available in the market that it can access. This occurs in both rural and urban settings throughout the region and can happen fairly abruptly if prices are to spike due to various market fluctuations, due to natural disasters that can impact supply, due to nervousness in countries that are exporting products, leading them to perhaps keep more of their food products at home, and so forth. Utilization is about whether these foods are healthy and nutritious, and whether you're going to avoid many of the problems of adulterification and also sort of nutritional deficits. It's not just about accessing calories, it's also about accessing the right kinds of calories. And here we see issues of changes in food choices, changes in dietary considerations that are having some health implications that show that food security is not just about getting food. It's also about maintaining a healthy diet.
Now, you spoke about maintaining a healthy diet, and now everybody's talking about genetic modifications. Now, how does that play an important role for food security, especially if it comes in the form in a non-traditional sense? Is there an argument and recommendations to it?
Absolutely. You're certainly right to point to genetically modified organisms and biotechnology more generally as being at the center of many of the more fierce debates surrounding food security in Asia presently. Right now we see genetically modified organisms and biotechnology being primarily employed in the United States and other parts of North and South America. It has not taken hold in the Asian region to that same degree, and in Europe it has come in for a lot of criticisms for various ethical, health, and environmental reasons. The employment of genetically modified technologies in Asia, however, is something that I think we could see increased attention to, and also something that could gain some momentum in the foreseeable future. There are several reasons why GMOs are attractive to governments and the private sector in the region. For one, GMOs can help to deal with many of the changing environmental conditions that we're seeing in the region. So these crops can often be drought resistant. They can be more robust in the face of large rain episodes. They can at times require less inputs in the form of fertilizers, pesticides, etc. They can be resistant to different pests, disease strains, and so forth. In combination, this can lead to greater yields on a per hectare basis. So you're getting more food out of less land, and that's really the goal that GMOs claim to be able to help to meet. Criticisms arise on multiple fronts. One is that these sorts of technologies can reduce biodiversity. They can lead to sort of monocropping plantations that have poor environmental records as far as housing different species and so forth, providing ecological services that are needed to continue to farm over a longer period of time. There are concerns about whether they are safe for public consumption in different forms and in different instances. And finally, on the economic side of it, there's a range of issues surrounding the intellectual property of biotechnologies. So if a corporation is to produce a certain seed variety, who has the ownership over that technology, over the patents involved? Can farmers access that technology on a consistent year-to-year basis? Can they use their own seeds? So on and so forth. So these are many of the challenges that GMO will have to overcome in Asia if it is to be employed on a larger scale than it is currently. But I think that there's interest there, and there are certainly research efforts going on throughout the region and government consultation going on as well that is trying to find the right place for GMO in Asia's agricultural future.
Now, you spoke about the agricultural future. What sort of investments do investors now should be looking for when it comes to investing in agriculture? Is investment in agriculture a sound investment?
Well, that's a good question. I would divide investment off on supply side on the one hand, and in sort of speculative market investment on the other side, so on the purchasing side. The supply side investments, I think that there certainly is evidence to suggest that money can be made from that. If you invest in new agricultural techniques and greater equipment and greater infrastructure that can help to bring crops to market more efficiently, reduce food wastage, etc., then you will increase the profitability of the farming systems in question. This can be undertaken in public-private partnerships, can also be undertaken through sort of state-level investment in those things like infrastructure that I've just mentioned, and also involve farmer cooperatives and different farmer groups that really are at the very ground level of producing the product itself. On the other side, on the sort of the more marketized side, through things like futures markets, through investing in cash transfers of food products, you then begin to deal with the sort of volatility that you see in a lot of different commodity markets. And I'm certainly not going to claim to be clever enough to give any sort of advice as to how safe a bet many of those speculative investments might be. But there's a great deal of uncertainty about the trajectory of pricing, and there are a lot of variables that can affect that. Everything from a natural disaster to a new government policy, which might subsidize food products, which might provide for minimum pricing standards for farmers, etc., can really impact these prices in ways that at times are somewhat unpredictable.
Now, how important is the United States has a key role in food security for the world?
The United States is an agricultural giant. There's no denying that. Products such as wheat, soy in particular, also many beef products, it really is one of the global leaders. And we should perhaps also put into that category Brazil and in some sectors Argentina. So between North and South America, you're looking at a very, very important part of the agricultural sector, globally speaking. When the United States has things such as a drought that's impacted corn production, maize production in a really significant way. This can impact global prices, certainly. And it also, interestingly enough, can have impacts across sectors. There is evidence to suggest that rice prices in Asia, for example, can be impacted by the changing production levels of different commodities in the United States and Russia and elsewhere, such as wheat, for example, as corn, as soybeans. We have to keep in mind that these products shouldn't be considered just in their own rights as products being consumed, but are also utilized as the major feedstocks for beef. So when we're talking about soy, corn, we're talking about beef pricing as well. Also products and processed foods, corn syrup, etc. So there can be really wide-ranging effects. Countries have been shown to, when wheat availability goes down, to reduce rice exports, for example. We saw that occur in 2007 and 2008, leading or contributing to the subsequent rice price crisis. So when the United States sneezes, the world can get a cold in the food sector.
Now, speaking about the United States, do you think countries around the world, especially policymakers, would like to decide whether they should impose an embargo or restrictions on how their food will be distributed? Mm-hmm. Do you foresee that?
In times of restrictions on supply, we've seen as a corollary, perhaps an understandable one, but at times an overutilized one or a panic-driven one, restrictions in exports. So if we want to talk about the Asian context, for example, when we saw some restrictions in supply of things like wheat and to a certain extent rice in 2007, 2008, we saw a restriction on exports by countries such as India, Thailand, subsequently Vietnam. This then creates a problem for the consumers, which begin what's often called panic buying, in which they become very, very concerned with the resiliency of their own supply systems and with all the social and political implications that come along with that. And they begin to try to purchase rice or whatever the product is in question at a more rapid rate, and they're willing to pay a higher price for that product in that environment. This then amplifies on itself, and before you know it, you have a skyrocketing price system, which interestingly enough sometimes becomes fairly disconnected from the actual shortage of the products. In 2007, 2008, there was a larger amount of rice on the market than the increasing prices might lead us to believe, but rather it was this process of export restrictions and really panic buying that drove the price increases at that point. There's certainly legitimate worry that sort of occurrence could happen again. And so, our position and some of our work here at the center suggests that it's important for countries in particular, and also the other stakeholders in the food sector, to try to make sober assessments of what the status is of available commodities, especially key commodities like rice, soy, wheat, corn, and to not allow runaway sort of amplifying market-based increases in pricing, because these are the very things that drive vulnerable, poor populations into places of food insecurity.
Now, about food security, Dr. Ewing, do you foresee that if Obama were to take on a new administration for his new term, do you foresee that he would impose new strategies and new measures for food security in case should ASEAN decide to impose restrictions and countries like Singapore that is heavily dependent on imports were able to get some form of aid from the United States?
Okay. Perhaps the most controversial element of the U.S. agricultural system, and that which might come in for some review over the next term for either President Obama or Governor Romney if he were to take office, would deal with subsidies for key commodities, and which can have a price distorting effect for consumers around the world and global prices more generally, and B, and this is a related point, the usage of corn as a biofuel, which also has the capacity to impact food prices in different sectors, again, given that corn is a feed product for for a feed commodity for other agricultural products like meat and so forth. This is encapsulated largely through what's called the Farm Bill in the United States, which does come under review and become updated periodically. Now, this is an important political issue in the United States in that the farming communities in the Midwest, Southeast to a lesser extent perhaps, are very have powerful political sway on the shape that the Farm Bill ultimately takes. Some of the subsidies that are in place and the guaranteed purchasing of corn for the production of ethanol and biofuel is something that is largely to their benefit, and so any sort of repeal or backtrack away from those policies will be politically difficult for either candidate, for whichever candidate assumes the presidency. That being said, internationally, these policies come under great criticism, and they are also inconsistent with many of the United States' own declarations about the importance of free market economic systems and so forth. So how is this relevant for ASEAN and Asia more generally? In your question, I think that if subsidies are reduced, then there could be a more competitive global food trade system or situation for particular commodities, and it could actually allow some of the farmers in Asia to access global markets or even regional markets in a way that currently they're not able to compete.
Now, how important is the United States for the Middle East and Africa? Because there's very much less mentioned about these two regions in terms of food security. Has the United States got an important role to play in terms of technology and such as biofuels and so forth, as well as technology to provide irrigation for Africa as well as the Middle East? Because food security in the Middle East and Africa right now has arisen to its challenge in trying to meet their demand for their population.
Sure. On the level of estate scale, large scale farming, the U.S. is a global leader on efficiencies, on technological capabilities, etc. So in that sense, yes, it does have potential roles to play in increasing both the efficiency and yields of farms in Africa or the Middle East, as well as the profitability of those farms. And the U.S. has played a role in this space before. During the Green Revolution of the 1960s and 70s, many U.S. universities, research organizations, through some public funding in the United States, really contributed to some of the large improvements in yields in places like India, other parts of Asia, and elsewhere. Now, to speak more specifically about the two regions you mentioned, the Middle East obviously has a water scarcity problem, and so their agricultural systems are really strained and constrained fundamentally in the sense of how much water is going to be available. So improved irrigation strategies in these locations could certainly open up new opportunities for them to become more self-sufficient in food production. That being said, the Middle East will continue to be dependent to an extent on exports, and those exports will come from the United States as well as elsewhere. The situation in Africa is somewhat different, and I think that the questions there are in some ways similar to those that we face in rural Southeast and South Asia, which is, will Africa go the way of these large estate farms, such as those that we see in the United States? Or will it continue to be a system or set of systems dominated by small-scale agriculture? And there are a lot of elements to that question. In the United States, as farms became larger and larger and larger, understandably the labor force involved in working on those farms became smaller and smaller and smaller, to the point where it's roughly at about 2%, if I'm not mistaken, currently. That really necessitates new labor opportunities for former farmers in other sectors, industry, urban environments, technical sectors, services, etc. And so managing that transition away from a largely agrarian-based economy to whatever comes next is something that is of great attention to policymakers here and in Africa, and it really creates some difficult questions about whether it is an effective and ideal situation to move towards an industrial farming type model such as that seen in the United States. The other option, or another set of options, and these two aren't necessarily mutually exclusive, is to pursue some level of estate farming to get the economies of scale and efficiency that brings along with it, while also trying to improve yields for small scale farmers to help them access certain technologies, help them access markets, and so forth. So try to emancipate both the small scale while getting greater productivity out of the larger scale.
Now, in these coming trends, and as the world grows, larger in population, because we just surpassed 7 billion right now. Now, it is said in the World Report that much of the world will be urbanized. Now, are we going to see rural agriculture being transferred and transformed into urban agriculture? Do you, like, for instance, a country like Singapore and probably even Israel, we begin to see a lot of R&D being put into farming in a building, probably like a condominium or whatsoever. Is that a possibility, and would that be realized?
Okay, it's an extremely important question, and I think that we are seeing real palpable momentum towards an increase in urban farming in many locations throughout the world. There are several benefits that can come from urban farming. One being that there's less transportation required for foods to feed the urban population itself. It can lend sort of greater self-sufficiency, not only for small countries like Singapore, but also for cities in and of themselves that can become less reliant on factors that are influencing agricultural production in the hinterlands or in other countries or regions of the world. It also can have a number of positive social effects, from everything from sort of community gardens and the relationships that can foster. It can help to create greater linkages between people and the food that they're eating, so that there's a greater recognition of what goes into those foods, a greater knowledge and transparency about the sources of food, and so on and so forth. So there's certainly plenty of reasons to pursue urban farming approaches and strategies. There is also plenty of promising technology out there for urban farming, and also instances of urban farming that have proven quite successful. Here in Asia, we see a great deal of urban farming in places like Shanghai, Hanoi, Vietnam. Areas of the United States, including New York City, are really at the helm of urban farming. And you mentioned Singapore, as well as some areas of the Middle East, is also being involved in some of the research and ambitious goals relating to urban farming. Limitations are there, however, and I think that we need to be modest to an extent in the role that urban farming will play in the foreseeable future, namely when it comes to those vital commodities that we were just speaking about, things like corn, soy, and by extension beef and pork, as well as rice and wheat. I do not foresee any substantial contribution to the acquisition of these key commodities from urban farming. I could be wrong about that. That's not a given. We are looking at things like rice production on rooftops, for example, and that's even been promoted here in Singapore. But what we're mainly talking about when we're discussing urban farming are more high value, smaller, less land intensive crops, fruits, vegetables, herbs, chilies, etc. Also some capacity for things like chickens and eggs, and also capacity for aquaculture. So we're not just talking about farming in buildings, we're also talking about peri-urban environments on the city's outskirts. We're talking about green spaces such as those in parks or between highways, as well as the sort of greenhouse approaches of high-rise buildings, in which you can create a kind of confined system that acts symbiotically to encourage sort of nutrient trickle down and so forth in ways that can produce some fairly efficient yields. The Singapore example sees the agri-veterinary authority set goals for increasing the percentage of certain products that will be produced domestically, looking years into the future, and then attempting to create policies and strategies to meet those goals. So increasing domestic production of things like fish, chicken, eggs, some vegetables, etc., are very much in the strategic thinking of Singapore. And while I know less about it, I'm quite sure that those same sorts of approaches are being pursued elsewhere.
Now, is food subsidies sustainable for policymakers and for corporations? Because food subsidies has been an issue and a subject matter around the globe. How do you see this as an advantage or a disadvantage?
Okay.
And can something be done about it?
Food subsidies play a different role in different countries, and as far as the capacity for food subsidy plans to strain budgets, I think we see a lot of variability there. So countries with access to a lot of capital, whether they be the sort of oil exporting nations of the Gulf, which we were speaking about previously, or countries with a very strong economy, can absorb some level of subsidy without creating long-term strains, or arguably speaking, for their budgets into the future. For other countries, this can become a very, very significant strain on their fiscal outlook. One country in particular that's come in for some criticism over subsidy policies of late is Thailand, which is pursuing a voucher program that guarantees a minimum price for rice purchases for farmers, which can distort some of the market pricing, which is a key element of subsidies that also comes under great criticism, and B, strain the budgets of Thailand looking forward, because we are talking about significant capital that's required to do that. At the same time, it does arguably benefit farmers in that it increases the price that they're receiving for their crops. Beyond all these points, which are the controversial elements of subsidies and the elements of subsidies that are often debated in things like the GATT framework for trade regulations, debated in forums such as the WTO, are less controversial and perhaps more beneficial approaches to subsidies, which are on the production side. So subsidizing the purchase of agricultural inputs, such as fertilizers, subsidizing the purchase of seeds or increasing access to seeds and new seed technologies, even subsidizing, in some cases, the energy usages of farms. So that has a less price distorting effect than subsidizing the actual purchase and consumer side of agricultural products.
Now, about climate change, how does climate change that been a impact for food security? Because right now we are seeing irregular weather around the world. Is there a buffer for such emergencies?
I think you've used a key word there in the question, which is irregular. The primary climate challenge or set of challenges arises out of eroding the predictability of weather and of seasons, and particularly in places like Asia, which depend on some level of predictability for things like monsoon seasons, for things like patterns of rainfall, levels of rainfall, periods of rainfall, etc. This can create a real problem. And the problems which are sort of structural and endemic over time, for example, flooding, drought, and so forth, are amplified by abrupt events like tropical storms, really heavy precipitation patterns, and so forth, which are being observed to both amplify and gain in strength and frequency as a result of climate change. Climate change is also showing itself to be moving the patterns of storm systems, which is leading to their impact on agricultural zones that have traditionally been outside of typhoon belts and so forth in Southeast Asia and South Asia and so forth. Beyond that, you have perhaps longer term problems that might arise from sea level rise, for example, which can increase agricultural cropping more generally. Just the simple increase in temperatures can change germination periods, can lead to situations like that in the United States in which you got burned out crops for this season and so forth. So really a host of issues that arise from climate change, and all the observable trends in emissions in the emission of greenhouse gases globally suggests that these problems will become more pronounced in the foreseeable future.
Now, what kind of challenges can policymakers as well as the corporations are able to meet and overcome these demands?
I think that there's a recognition now that it's time to reinvest in agriculture in a substantial way, both in the public sector as well as through encouraging public-private partnerships and the presence of private sector investment into the sector. Now, what that investment goes to will largely dictate, I think, the effectiveness of the resulting policies. We need investment in things like infrastructure that can bring crops to market more efficiently, need investment in things like electricity generation and access, which can improve refrigeration and reduce food spoilage, etc. We also need investment in agricultural technologies and research institutions, academically on the social scientific level, as well as in places like the International Rice Research Institute, Institute for Food Policy Research, and so forth, which can help to create the necessary inputs and approaches that are needed for more efficient agriculture moving into the future. You mentioned population growth earlier, but a combination of population growth, urbanization, and increasing affluence means that we really need to produce more food, quality food, moving forward, and that this will have to be undertaken without continuing to bring more and more land under cultivation. So efficiency really is the key there, and I think that investment towards efficiency in food systems generally need to be prioritized by governments, and there are signs that it is. Food security, broadly defined investment, has really reduced over the last 10 to 15 years. There was the feeling that after the really large-scale investment of the Green Revolution period, that the food problem had largely been solved. And I think that the events really of 2007 and 8, moving into the high prices of 2010 and now 2012, have shown policymakers that in actuality we need to redouble some of those efforts.
Now, what do you see in ASEAN as well as the cooperation with the United States in the next 5 years? Will there be some high-level agreements on food security, and also to combat against climate change, and also to invite more investments to ensure that there will be sufficient issues that will be addressed should security for food has been challenged?
There's no doubt that these issues that you mentioned, food security, climate change, investment, are on ASEAN's agenda. Currently, ASEAN has a number of sort of forums and policies related to food security. Specifically, one of the most sort of talked about of those policies currently has to do with the storage of rice and building resiliency in key commodities. So ASEAN, along with its +3 partners, Japan, China, and the Republic of Korea, South Korea, are pursuing an agreement which will have them guarantee part of their stockpiles, along with all ASEAN member states, towards emergency relief in the case of severe food insecurity. You've got other policies that are relating to natural disaster mitigation and also response, both relating to climate change and those relating to the food shortages that can come in these instances of natural disasters. On climate change, there are questions about whether ASEAN should have a uniform front and platform at an international level, and at present I think that those conversations are still ongoing, and there are arguments on both sides of that equation. But given that Southeast Asia is a region that relies to a large extent on land-based economies and on the agricultural systems that play such a key social and economic element in the various countries of the region. It's unsurprising that ASEAN would view these areas with some degree of prioritization, and I don't think that that's going to change moving forward.
Now, speaking about food security, one must confess that we can't go without water, and as well as energy. Could you give us some insights on what's happening right now on the issue of energy and water? Because water right now has been an issue that's been on the table for a while, because it seems that policymakers are trying to address to say that they're running out of water. The world is running out of water, and the population growth of 7 billion or so doesn't seem to be sustainable.
Okay.
So what is your findings tell you?
Okay. I would take issue with the assertion that we're running out of water globally, or that the Earth cannot sustain a population of, say, 9 to 10 billion, which is projected by the year 2050 from an aggregated water perspective. The difficulty with water is its distribution. So while you have countries such as Brazil and Canada, which are very, very water abundant, you have regions such as the Middle East, which are very water scarce. And so part of this equation ties directly to agriculture, because agriculture is far and away the largest consumer of water globally. It dwarfs domestic consumption, and industrial consumption doesn't come close to agriculture either. So our water and our food are intricately linked, and we can't really disinvest between those two factors. When we're importing food, we're essentially importing the water that's embedded within that food. So the capacity for water abundant regions to export food to water scarce regions can help those countries that overcome their water scarcity problems. So imports and a robust global market, or at least regional market for food, is a key element to a strategy for overcoming deficits in water access, water capacity. Beyond that, though, even in relatively water abundant regions such as Southeast Asia, which has a higher rate of precipitation than the global average, does have a higher rate of water per capita than the global average, you still see water problems, water management problems. Many of these relate to transboundary water resources. In South Asia, we have the Mekong coming down from the Tibetan Plateau, going through numerous countries before emptying out through the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. South Asia, the situation is relatively comparable. There you have major rivers like the Brahmaputra and the Ganges that cross international boundaries and have to be shared and have to be managed in ways that can allow these countries the water that they need, mainly for agricultural production, but also for domestic and industrial usages. Large countries such as China also see difficulties in sharing water domestically and in managing water resources domestically, and China faces some fairly formidable challenges along those lines, leading them to some very ambitious engineering projects that are also very controversial as to whether they'll be effective water management practices and approaches. So I think that my main answer to your question is that water problems are local. Water problems are regionally specific and should be analyzed on those terms rather than from a more global perspective. You ask about energy as well, which is also intricately tied to agriculture, and agriculture is a fairly energy-intensive process. At present, there is room for further mechanization of agriculture in many parts of Asia and Africa, etc. But this obviously has an impact on energy security. Where will the energy be accessed, and also has implications for climate change, because this can lead to increased greenhouse gas emissions as a part of the modernization of those systems. So both of those issues create a number of questions. The energy trajectory for this region is one of continuing fossil fuel usage into the future. Perhaps an expansion of gas usage, natural gas, as new unconventional sources of gas come online as we're seeing in other parts of the world as well,
Mhm.
along with some possibilities of more renewables or even nuclear energy entering into the sort of overall makeup of the energy equation. That being said, Southeast Asia specifically, and also in East Asia and South Asia more generally, fossil fuels aren't going anywhere. They're going to continue to be the primary drivers of economic growth, and this has a great deal of relevance to food production.
Do you foresee that nuclear energy will be a driving force for ASEAN? And do you think, because there has been some talk about nuclear energy, especially in R&D sectors as well, and the governments are in ASEAN are very much interested to have a co-sharing focus on how nuclear energy can be distributed to among ASEAN neighbors.
Right.
Do you see that a feasible plan as well as probably a political ideology?
Okay. Really two elements, I think, to that question. One on the future of nuclear power, and second on distribution of power, electricity more generally. There are plans that have been discussed for years about an integrated ASEAN electricity grid that will allow for the transfer of power across state lines in a very efficient way. We do see the selling of power currently. Countries such as Laos, for example, can sell power mainly from their hydroelectric generation plants to Thailand and China on their borders. Now, an integrated grid system could increase opportunities like that for more transfers of power across international boundaries. And that can occur whether we're talking about nuclear or whether we're talking about conventional coal-fired power plants, natural gas, electricity generation, or hydropower. The logistics involved in that, both politically and sort of structurally, an engineering perspective, are formidable. So while that conversation has been ongoing, it will be some time, I think, before we see a real in earnest infrastructure development projects in place that can make that vision a real reality. With nuclear power, at this point it's in an exploratory phase in ASEAN. You're right in the sense that there is great interest in the R&D side of nuclear. Countries like Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam have explored these possibilities, continue to explore them. The Philippines also is part of the conversation in that it had a fledgling nuclear facility that it had partnered with the United States with previously. It has long been shut down but could hypothetically be reconstituted. Singapore is part of the conversation in that it has explored opportunities for nuclear. At present, has not viewed that as being really a viable pathway forward, but could be involved in some of the research and development side, research reactors, etc., that end up being brought online in the region. There's also a prestige element to the nuclear conversation in that countries are said to view the production of a nuclear system as a testament to their own technological prowess, and that this could actually lead to other countries desiring to go down that same path. All that being said, we're years away from a nuclear reactor being brought online in Southeast Asia, and there's no guarantee that any of these projects are ultimately pursued in earnest. I think when talking about nuclear power in Asia, at present it's wise to talk more about the expansion of nuclear power in China, for example, and its increased role in power generation there, as well as the uncertain future of nuclear power in a place like Japan. South Korea continues to export nuclear technology internationally, so there is a lot going on in Asia with nuclear. We obviously have the nuclear programs both in Pakistan and India, which have their own security implications as well. But in ASEAN, I think that the conversation is really an order of magnitude behind many of those.
Dr. Ewing, before we go, could you give us 3 key recommendations for food security today for policymakers as well as corporations who are now trying to pursue and combat issues like food shortages and also inflation in the coming months and probably in the coming few years?
Certainly. One thing that I think I've mentioned in several of my answers that I'd like to just highlight once again before saying goodbye is the importance of efficiency in food systems. And I think that there are really massive efficiency improvements that are possible in the developing economies throughout the world, many of whom depend on agriculture on multiple levels, both for food security as well as for the economic and social progress of large swaths of their citizenries. If we can make agricultural systems more efficient through sharing best practices, through helping different farmers and large collective farm systems access markets efficiently, if we can reduce wastage both on the production side and the consumer side, then we will really be improving the overall food security picture globally, regionally, and on local levels. How do we do that? Investment is certainly part of that. And so really exploring the most effective means of a mixture of public and private investment into the agricultural sector. And this can be location specific. This will not be a one-size-fits-all sort of answer, but my second recommendation would be to improve public-private partnerships for investment in the production side and research side, etc., to help to reach that first goal, which is greater efficiencies. And then the final point that I would highlight is to find the right balance between protecting the interests of your farming populations and the benefits that can arise from free market or freer markets for agricultural commodities. Agricultural commodities, particularly key commodities such as rice in Asia, are often heavily politicized. And that's understandable because of the important role that they play in the societies that governments are really attempting to serve. But at the same time, heavy government intervention can actually reduce efficiencies. It could distort prices. It could lead to a great deal of secrecy and lack of transparency in different market systems, and ultimately these can have the absolute opposite effect that they were intended to have, which is to try to protect the farming population and ensure affordability throughout the market. So more robust trading systems in the food sector can actually, rather than leading to greater volatility, actually make food more affordable and more stable in the longer term, and more accessible for those who are the most vulnerable to sudden shifts in different dynamics.
Well, Dr. Ewing, thank you for sharing with us about the global perspective on food security, as well as how the United States plays its important role on these issues. And once again, I'm Robin Steinberg. Thank you for joining me for watching the issues on perspectives on food security in the world, globally, involving in the United States and Middle East and so forth, with Dr. Jackson Ewing from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And once again, I'm Robin Steinberg. Have a good week ahead.